The coffee was lousy, but obviously the locals liked it as the cafe was packed at 11 inches the morning. I'd had worse, but it was a close call. More coffee, hon? No thanks. How much do I owe you? $3. I handed the waitress a $5 note and a smile. Thanks, keep the change. Okay, you have a good day. Small towns? The people are friendly, but at times it felt like nothing else existed except the town and its personalities. I grew up in a small town and worked a farm before I went into the army as an aircraft technician. That's just army speak for a mechanic. I'd gotten out of the service a year ago and decided to see more of the country. I guess I was at the moment nothing more than a drifter on walkabout, often viewed with suspicion anywhere I went. I guess being 6'4" and 220 pounds made me a magnet for the eye as well. But at 37 years old, I was used to the occasional stares. Being constantly on the road lately had given me a nice tan instead of my usual pasty white skin when working indoors. That's why I preferred to be in a city, as I wasn't noticed. I decided to move on straight away from this town as it gave me the creeps. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I trusted my instincts. The town was called Blackridge and was a well-maintained pretty town, but I just didn't like the place. I made my way out of the town and was just reaching the town limits when I sensed a car pulling up near me. I looked around and sure enough it was a cop car. Hey there, Slick. You moving on? Yep, sure am. Good to hear. We don't like vagrants mucking up the town. I'm a bit of a smartass and was about to return serve when I thought better of it. Well, I better get moving. You do that. With that, the cop pulled away and did a U-turn heading back to Blackridge. I had a chuckle to myself. Small town cops could be real assholes, but I was just looking to move on and maybe find some work at the next town as I was running a little low on funds. I'd been walking for about 30 minutes when I saw a vehicle up ahead with its hazard lights on. I came closer and saw a pretty woman of about 35 cursing and kicking her car. I figured I better try to see what the problem was. Hey there, miss. Need some help? Oh, hi, yeah, I do. I'm a bit embarrassed. I've got a flat tire and I'm having problems with the wheel lugs. Here, allow me. I took over and changed the tire in less than 5 minutes, including putting the shredded tire in the boot of her car. Well, there you go, miss. Don't forget to have the tire in the boot repaired. You have a good day, you hear? Wait up, mister. It's Stephen Cahill. Well, I'm Mrs. Helen Nolan. Please, can I give you a ride somewhere? Thanks for the offer, Mrs. Nolan, and if it wouldn't be a problem, just take me as close to the next town as possible. Sure. Hop in, Stephen, and you can call me Helen. She smiled. I put my backpack in the boot and jumped into the front seat of the expensive BMW. Helen Nolan struck me as a woman of privilege and wealth. She looked out of place in a town like Blackridge. Helen started the car, and we hit the road. So what brings you to Blackridge, Stephen? Oh, I'm just passing through. Passing through? Yeah, I've been on the road for the past year or so getting to see more of our fine country. I see. What did you do before that? I was in the army. Wow, the army like shooting guns and all that stuff? Well, not really. I was a mechanic more or less, but I still had to qualify on the range and do a survival course every year. Why did you leave? Well, I did my 20 years and just decided at 37 it was time to get out and explore. So what's your story, Helen? No real story, Stephen. I'm married, no kids, and live on a large property about 20 kilometers from here. Okay, so what does Mr. Nolan do? You mean apart from drinking, spending money, and chasing women? Sorry, I shouldn't pry. No, I'm sorry, that was uncalled for. Greg owns Blackridge. What do you mean owns Blackridge? He's a real estate mogul and deals mostly in hotels and commercial properties. Why buy the town then? Oh, a couple of reasons, I guess. First, because he was born here, and secondly, because the town's land value will go up in the next 5 years or so. How? The government is building a large new highway that goes right by Blackridge. Business will be booming and Greg will make a killing. Wow. Yeah, wow is the word. So, what's waiting at the next town? Nothing really, just a motel bed, then I'll look for some work to tie me over. Work, you say? I know this might sound crazy, but how would you like to work for me? In what capacity? Well, my handyman/property manager just quit. I need someone with skills, and you said you were a mechanic. Well, I don't know. Come on, I won't bite. All right, let's say a trial 2-week period and see how we go from there. Sounds like a deal. We will pay you $650 a week, which includes room and board. I hope you don't mind working on a farm. Not at all. I grew up on a farm. Well, a man of many talents. Greg will be pleased. We drove further on and then turned left up a dirt road. I saw lots of cattle and sheep on the property. The buildings were large and looked virtually new. There were stables, a large shed, but what stood out above everything else was the large white mansion. Welcome to the White Castle, Stephen. I stood out front of this monstrosity and couldn't believe my eyes. It was the biggest mansion I had ever seen. "Steven, I'll grab Helga, our head maid, and she will show you to your quarters. After you have a shower and change, I'll introduce you to Greg." With that said, a small tubby woman of about 60 appeared and led me away from the mansion to a small cottage. I went in and was duly impressed. The cottage had a large open-plan kitchen and living room. The bedroom contained a large queen bed, built-in closets, and en-suite bathroom. I decided to take the hint and I had a long, refreshing shower. I then unpacked my meager possessions and changed into jeans and a shirt. It was then time to meet the infamous Greg Nolan. Greg Nolan was around 50 years of age. He was fit, and from a woman's perspective, I'd say handsome. He shook my hand and asked me to take a seat. "So Helen tells me you are going to be our new handyman." "Yes, sir. That's if you think I'm qualified." "Qualified? Well, just what are your skills?" I went on to explain that I had been raised on a farm and spent the last 20 years in the service of the Army as a helicopter mechanic. Greg Nolan seemed satisfied. "Well, very good, Mr. Cahill. I'll get Ronald to show you round tomorrow. Ronald is my head of security. Until then, have a nice night." I'd obviously been dismissed. I wandered around the property until Helga found me. I then had dinner with the other staff. There was Julian the butler, who was married to Helga, David, who was Mr. Nolan's personal chauffeur, Rebecca the cook, and finally Liz the maid. I was hoping to get to know Liz a whole lot better. She was a real beauty of about 25 and had a body to die for. With dinner and introductions done, I headed back to my cottage and hit the sack. I woke up at around 6 a.m., feeling refreshed. I looked through the kitchen and found it well stocked. I drank a coffee, had a shower, and changed into some old fatigues and a shirt. I headed up to the house and had breakfast. I figured the big meathead staring at me while I ate breakfast must have been Ronald. I was right. Ronald had an ex-cop look about him, and I was spot on again. Ronald was an ex-New South Wales drug detective, and he obviously liked to dabble in steroids and hit the weights. He was a mountain of a man at around 6 foot 3 inches and probably 240 pounds. Ronald showed me around the property, including the no-go areas, which included the main house and a large hangar and airfield. I could go anywhere else. I hadn't noticed right away, but there were security cameras placed everywhere. I was starting to wonder what was really going on at this property. When I asked Ronald about my predecessor, he only said that he was a drunk and had disappeared, leaving no forwarding address. It was a good feeling getting my hands dirty again. I assessed the property and I knew the most urgent job was repairing the fences. The Nolans had a man called Zach who looked after the animals and such, and he worked during the day but didn't live at the White Castle like the rest of us. My job was just to maintain the buildings and property boundaries, including the equipment. For the first few weeks, I got stuck into the fencing and made a lot of headway. I rarely saw Greg, Helen, or Ronald. The only time in the first month that I talked to Helen was after 2 weeks to say I was happy and would continue on full-time. That seemed to please her. I had come to find the staff an interesting bunch. I didn't much care for Julian or Helga, as they were very full of themselves. I took a real shine to David and Liz, who were very down-to-earth. Rebecca was okay, but we didn't have many common interests, and so we didn't have much to talk about. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was off about this household. For one thing, Helen seemed like a prisoner in the house, as she only went out once a week, and that was to Blackridge for a couple of hours. In the first month, I observed a hell of a lot of activity at the hangar, and the plane would take off at night and never made runs during the day. Ronald seemed to practically live at the hangar, while Greg I rarely saw. It was in the second month on the job when a few things started to really send warning bells off in my head. David and I had become buddies as we had a lot in common. He was an ex-military man like myself. We started playing cards and having a few drinks each night. It was nearing the end of the night when I made an off-the-cuff remark. "I tell you what, David, I don't know what the last guy did as the handyman, but it sure wasn't working." "Yeah, old Max, he was a weird one, that's for sure." "What do you mean, David?" "Nothing really, he just had these wild stories and theories. I didn't hold much stock in them, as they only ever came out when he was drunk, which I can't tell you is often." "Humor me. This stays strictly between us, right, mate?" "Of course." "Well, and this is funny. He reckons that Greg Nolan is a drug runner or mob guy. The other story he loved to tell was that Greg was screwing Liz and his wife in some sort of threesome deal. As I said, he was as mad as a cut snake. A light bulb went off in my head and the bells were ringing. "So when did Max tell you all this?" "I can't remember the first time, but he was telling me every day for the last 2 weeks until he up and left. By then he was drinking hard, so he just ran his mouth." "So why did he leave?" "I don't know, but it wasn't a surprise. I mean, Max had been working the property for 10 years or so, but his work ethic went out the window. The guy was funnily enough an ex-cop, but got booted off the force for drinking on the job or something. You should have seen his room. He had newspaper cutouts, notepads, everything on Greg Nolan. It was weird, but he had a real hard-on for Greg. I'd say he just crawled into a bottle somewhere. He'll turn up sometime. So where was his room? You're sitting in it, mate. So where is his stuff? Ronald boxed it up, and it's probably been destroyed. I don't know, who cares anyway. Yeah, sounds far-fetched to me as well. David and I chatted for a few more minutes, and then he left. It was only 9 p.m., so I grabbed a beer and sat down to think. I wasn't a cop, but I knew things weren't right. For starters, why did a real estate guy need a security force? Why the night flights? Why the no-go zones? Where was Max, and why was Helen basically a prisoner in her own home? Greg Nolan owned Blackridge, and by default owned the townspeople. I knew deep down that Max was onto something, and that something got him killed. Max's disappearance didn't fit. He'd been drinking since he was a cop, so why suddenly leave after 10 years in good-paying work? No, Max was dead, and I had to be very careful and get to the bottom of things without tipping anyone off. I worked all day Friday and was nearly complete on the refencing. As it was payday again, I decided to go into town on Saturday and buy myself a car. I wasn't under any restrictions, and the weekends were my own. Early Saturday morning, David gave me a lift into Winston Valley, the town I was originally headed to when I first left Blackridge months ago. I didn't want to buy any goods in Blackridge if I could help it. I found a used car lot and started looking at vehicles. A 1997 Toyota Corolla caught my eye. It had done some miles, but I checked the car and the logbooks over, and it was in tip-top mechanical shape. I made a good deal with the salesman, and he was going to put new tires on and a tank full of fuel. It would be ready to collect at 1 p.m. With that progress made, I called David to tell him of my good fortune and that I would find my own way back. Having a few hours to kill, I went to a small cafe and had something to eat. After I walked around fairly aimlessly to get the lay of the land, I found that the library was open on Saturdays, so I went in to do some research on Greg and Helen Nolan. I wanted to know what I was up against. The librarian showed me to the microfilm room where I could go through newspapers going back several decades. They also had computers which linked onto the internet. For the next 2 hours, I went through decades of newspapers and did a search on the internet, and it was well worth it. I knew at the end of my time at the library that I was in a world of trouble, and I had to get out. Greg Nolan's story was one of interest. I knew all the basic facts beforehand: that he was a multi-millionaire that had inherited his father's real estate development business. Greg had then shot for the moon and started investing in hotels. He hit pay dirt when he started the budget Bayside hotel chain. Going back, his childhood was one of privilege, but he was very rebellious and landed himself in military school to avoid jail time. He had some very shady friends, and there were question marks over his business dealings. Greg Nolan had been investigated by the federal police and tax department, but he was like Teflon, as nothing ever stuck. The Blackridge buy-up was interesting. It seemed as if Nolan, through his political connection, found out many months before the announcement that a highway was being built next to the town. He then went about buying up the cheap land in and around Blackridge. It seemed that those who wouldn't sell had mysteriously either disappeared or had acts of arson pre-formed on their properties. To make matters worse, Greg Nolan's best friends were the mayor and police chief. Helen Nolan née Williams was also interesting. She had met Greg at university when he went there for a business lecture. Helen had a degree in international banking, and Greg charmed his way into her heart despite the 15-year age gap. She first worked for him at Nolan Investments and then married him. I couldn't find much else of importance on the Nolans. I did a quick search on Ronald Graves and was stunned at the result. Prior to Ronald becoming the head of security for Nolan Investments, he had been a New South Wales detective. Ronald Digger Graves was the worst kind of cop imaginable. He had been severely reprimanded over his brutal interrogation tactics. He had been investigated by the Independent Police Commission on charges of corruption, and there were various suspicious shootings and beatings. Nothing stuck, but the heat was on, and he finally resigned from the police force to work for Greg Nolan. It was nearing 1 p.m., so I had time for one more search on Max Shillington, who I had replaced. Max looked to have been a damn good cop. He had an impressive arrest record and had numerous citations for bravery. Max was the complete opposite to Ronald Graves. It didn't say much about his drinking, but another article about the death of his wife and daughter in a plane crash spoke volumes. He was a good man, and it seemed once a cop, always a cop. I knew for sure Max was dead. I left the library with a sore head and information buzzing about. I brought a disposable mobile phone and then headed over to the car dealership and picked up the Toyota. I figured it was time to head over to Blackridge and discreetly look around. I ended up at the same cafe that I had coffee at months before. I didn't think I could stomach the coffee again, so I ordered a chocolate milkshake and some pie. I looked around and the cafe was pretty quiet. A man of about 55 nodded in my direction and motioned me over, so I grabbed my shake and pie and joined him. "Well, you must be the new handyman at the Nolan's place." "Yes, sir. I'm Stephen Cahill. I'm Toby Walters, a friend of Max Shillington's. You have an ex-military look about you. What gave me away?" "Your eyes, the way you walk and talk." "Well, sir, I'm ex-Army." "Ex-Army, yeah, you look it. I'm ex-Navy myself." "Have you heard from Max?" "I'll never hear from Max again." I looked at the man and made a gut call that would either kill me or help me. "Toby, we need to talk and away from here." It was agreed we would meet at his house tomorrow for lunch. With that done, I paid my bill and left to head back to the Nolan property. I arrived back at White Castle and ran straight into Ronald Graves. "Where the hell you been?" "Buying a car." "What's it to you, musclehead?" "I like to know where Nolan's people are at all times." "Hey pal, weekends are mine, and you aren't my boss. Just watch your step. I've got my eye on you." "No worries, Ronnie. I'll keep you informed every time I have a shit." "Screw you, shithead." Lovely. I now had the musclehead on my back. I would have to play things very cool. Something had been eating away in the back of my mind, and after visiting the library, it didn't make sense. Max Shillington was a good cop, so why would he have all the articles hanging about for anyone to see, or in this case seize? From what I read about Max, it had to be a smokescreen. There had to be something that was overlooked in the cottage, as I knew Ronald's expertise wasn't in searching for lost goods. I spent the next few hours tearing up the cottage and had found nothing. I was about to give up when I looked over to the fireplace. I had a good look in it and I hit gold. I found a loose floorboard right near the fireplace. It came away and there was something underneath. I put my hand down and brought up a diary. Max was no idiot. The diary was eye-opening and answered a lot of questions. The first entry was on January 23rd and the last entry was on February 16th. I had began working for the Nolans in March. January 23rd. I'm onto something. I spoke with my old partner Mac, and Ronald Graves is the worst kind of scum. A corrupt ex-cop who killed and bent the law at his will. I don't know who is worse, him or Nolan. I've decided to keep notes in case something happens, and hopefully this will get to Mac. I am going to have to do something soon, as I fear for Helen, and I'd die if anything happened to her. January 25th. It has been an emotional day. Graves and Nolan left on an overnight trip. Helen and I made sweet love, but she was crying over and over and kept saying, "Oh Max, I'm married to a monster. A sick, twisted monster. I will have to make my move soon." January 26th. I was nearly caught. I hope Helga keeps her mouth shut, as I suspect she saw something. Helen is worried and so am I. We have decided to cool things down. Nolan's next trip is on February 3rd. January 29th. I've decided to move most of my notes to the only local man I trust, Toby Walters. I had everything together, but I was followed by Graves to Blackridge. I now know I'm under surveillance. I'll have to organize delivery later. Graves has also installed security cameras close to the hangar and airstrip. I got in contact with Mac, but he needs evidence before anyone can proceed. Nolan has paid off all the right people. On the 3rd, I'm going to check the hangar out. I'm taking this monster down. February 4th. Jesus Christ, it's worse than I thought. I thought this man was only into drugs and money laundering. He is into human trafficking as well. He has opened a brothel in Blackridge filled with Asian girls, mainly from China, Vietnam, and Indonesia. The whole town has been paid off. The mayor knows and the cops know. Helen says this is to satisfy his and Graves' sexual urges, as well as make some money and film prominent members of the community for blackmail. Helen has been pulled into some sick shit as well, and she is in fear of her life. It looks as if Graves and Nolan are 50-50 partners on the illegal stuff. February 9th. I think they are on to me. I need to move Helen and probably Liz as well. Julian and Helga can't be trusted. David is a good man, and I've dropped obvious suggestions, but he's too dumb to pick them up and run with them. Toby is the only backup I've got. He is aware of the plan, but wants me to wait. Helen loves me and I love her, and my gut says to grab her and run, but I can't in good conscience walk away from this. The monster needs to be stopped. February 16th. The plan is set, and we move tonight. Helen and Liz are packed and ready to leave. I will hit the hangar, set up listening devices, get the evidence, and then we leave this shithole behind. Mac can then move on these monsters and put them down. My conscience is clear. I have to admit I miss being a cop, but not as much as I would miss having Helen. I had to grab a stiff drink after reading the diary. It was obvious Max walked straight into a trap, and he was killed. This explained why Helen was a prisoner. Someone had turned on him. I suspected Helga, but in reality, I couldn't trust anyone. I didn't even trust David, as he could have been feeling me out in case Helen had talked. I had to assume I was under 24-hour surveillance. I'm sure glad I brought that mobile phone now. I decided to return the diary and also the phone to the secure hiding spot near the fireplace. I had to find some way to talk to Helen Nolan privately, but first I had to catch up with Toby Walters. I had brought a map of Blackridge and studied it. I figured Ronald Graves would follow me tomorrow, and I needed to lose him. I found the answer on the map. Toby's place was not far away from the local cinema. I would park my car at the complex, buy a ticket to whatever was playing, and then make my exit on foot to Toby's. Hopefully it would work. I left Sunday at around 10 a.m. with the diary. Sure enough, as predicted, I could make out a black SUV following me. Ronald Graves was on my trail. I casually drove to the cinema and parked out front. I went in and brought a ticket to some drama which had a nearly 3-hour playing time and went into the darkened cinema. I gave it 10 minutes and then went into the toilets which couldn't be seen from the front doors. Inside the cubicle there was a window above. I opened it and slipped out the back of the cinema. I peeked around the corner and saw the SUV parked out the front with the driver reading a sports magazine. It wasn't Graves, but it was definitely one of his men. I would have to avoid anyone seeing me on the streets as I believed everyone was in Nolan's pocket. It took me 15 minutes, but I made it to Toby Walters' house on the outside of town without being seen. I went around the back of the house and knocked on the door. Toby answered. I was expecting a knock on the front door, not the back. Sorry, Toby, but I was followed. Shit, you better get inside. Toby, before we talk, you better read this. With that, I handed the diary over to Toby. Toby read the entries. Bloody hell, I can't believe it. Max really had something on Greg Nolan, and he was screwing Helen Nolan. My friend Max had a death wish. Maybe so, but he had them dead to rights. Someone betrayed him. Why do you care? I don't know really, I just don't like to see good people die or get hurt so scumbags can make another $1 million. My brother is a cop, and pricks like Ronald Graves give him a bad name. I guess they are good reasons. Well, let's just say I believe in doing the right thing. So have you told anyone else about this? No, Toby, why would I? No, that's good. You can't trust anyone in this town. So who do you think betrayed Max? I don't know, I told him not to go back to that hangar, but he wouldn't listen, the fool. You are aware that Julian and Helga are Ronald Graves' parents, don't you? No, shit, it must have been them. Well, so what else do you know, Toby? Oh, a little more than Max as of now. Such as? Well, Max was nearly right. Nolan and Graves own Blackridge. They dabble in drugs, money laundering, shady land deals, and human trafficking. The good-looking females are sent to the brothel, and the rest of them are harvested for organs. Very profitable arrangement for all concerned. Jesus Christ. How do you know this? Oh, because I work for them. With that, Toby had a gun leveled at my chest. Don't move, Mr. Cahill. You're just like Max, too smart for your own good. Graves was right to have me befriend you. The diary has just been an added bonus in so many ways. You betrayed Max and now me. Why? Oh, Mr. Cahill, for the oldest reason in the world. For profit. Money, and lots of it, plus the free sex is great as well. You piece of shit. Now, Mr. Cahill, that sort of language is beneath you. I told you in my opening statement that Nolan owned us all, and to trust nobody. You didn't listen. Now I get to kill you and I get my bonus. Any last requests? Yeah, what's the bonus? Why, it's Helen Nolan. Greg and Graves are done with her, and I hear pretty little Liz is finally taking her spot over in the bedroom. David and Liz have been quite the little spies for the organization. You have been played from the minute you entered Blackridge. Helen was such a fool trying to recruit someone after losing Max. Well, goodbye, Stephen. I let out a huge yell and charged at the despicable Toby Walters. Walters fired the handgun, and then the world went black. Ronald Graves was sitting at his desk back in the White Castle. Everything was going to plan, and the money was rolling in. Soon they would be rid of Helen Nolan and Stephen Cahill. The bitch sure had surprised them when she brought a stranger home and gave him Max's old job. Luckily, they were able to keep her away from Cahill, and shortly all threats would be neutralized. He might give Helen some goodbye sex before they sent her drugged up and off to Toby Walters. With that thought ending, the phone rang. Graves. Hey, it's me. Well, Toby Walters. What a surprise. What's the good word? He's dead. So Mr. Cahill did turn up. I'll give him credit, he was inventive. I'll have to fire that moron Duncan for letting Cahill give him the slip at the cinema. Yeah, so I'll bury him next to Max in the backyard. When do I get Helen? Tonight. I'll get someone to drop her out the front of your place. Remember, you get her for 24 hours only. Once that time is up, you are to shoot her and bury her on top of Max. That's Nolan's orders. If I see her walking around Blackridge, you will be joining Mr. Shillington and Mr. Cahill's 6 foot under. I understand, Mr. Graves. Good, now don't you have some gardening to do? I woke up with blood all around me. I was in quite a deal of pain. I quickly assessed my injuries. I had a wound to my forehead, but it was really just a bad graze despite the blood pouring out. The worst injury was to the right side of my body. It was leaking blood, but it was more a flesh wound. And if I stopped the bleeding, I would survive, as the bullet was a through and through. I looked around for Toby, but I couldn't see him. I heard whistling outside, and he was digging a hole and using a hose to soften the ground. I figured I had 10 minutes maximum. The first thing I did was find some cotton to plug my wound. With that done, I went searching for a weapon, and I was in luck. Walters was a real amateur. Firstly, he didn't check me for a pulse, and then he left his gun loaded and sitting on the coffee table. I checked the gun over, and I was ready to kill for the first time in my life. I just had to will myself not to pass out again, or I would really be dead. 10 minutes seemed like 10 hours, and I was finding it difficult to stay awake. The whistling and opening of the fly screen door alerted me to the fact that Toby Walters had returned. I didn't hesitate. As soon as he walked into the room, I fired 3 shots, which hit him center mass in the chest. He had a look of pure shock as he slumped to the floor. I staggered over and put the rest of the bullets into his prone body. Mr. Walters would not be returning from the dead. The world started getting fuzzy, and I sat down on the lounge and passed out. I awoke to the sound of someone yelling, "Special delivery," and tearing off down the road laughing. I made it to the door and found Helen Nolan tied up on the front porch. As I helped Helen in, she looked completely out of it. Drugged, I thought to myself. I untied Helen and got her away from the dead body. I put her in the master bedroom to sleep it off. I needed help desperately, but I knew no one close by, and I couldn't go to the hospital as that would be a death sentence. For the first time in my life, I prayed. I was exhausted, and the loss of blood wasn't helping. I passed out. The world faded out yet again. I woke up and found myself undressed in bed. I was sore, but it seemed as if someone had attended to my wounds. I felt hot, but I was alive, and it was a glorious feeling. I saw a figure sleeping in a rocking chair in the corner. It was Helen Nolan. I had almost forgotten she was here. I soon fell asleep once more. A cold compress was on my forehead, and Helen was wiping down my body when I was next conscious. "Thank you," I whispered. "Hush now. Rest, but we have to move soon." I next found myself in a Ford Falcon and heading out of Blackridge. We must have traveled for around 2 hours. Helen found a hotel, and she helped me inside to the bed. She redressed my wounds and gave some pain medication. I was soon nodding off, and the blackness engulfed me once again. The fever finally broke the next day, but I was still groggy, and it was back in the car, and we drove once more for another couple of hours and ended up at another hotel. I could smell the ocean, so I knew we were by the seaside this time. I awoke the next morning feeling a lot better. I was still very tender, but the wounds would heal with time. "Thank God you're awake." Helen Nolan rushed over to the bed and hugged me with tears gushing out. I held her as she sobbed. "It's okay, Helen. We're alive," I said as I gently rocked her. I held Helen for 10 minutes until she calmed down. I needed to ask some questions. "Helen, what happened? How did we get here?" "Well, I only remember Graves' men dropping me off at Toby Walters' house. I woke up the next morning and found you unconscious. I dressed your wounds and got you into bed. I then buried Toby Walters." "Didn't the dead body worry you?" "No. Look, my father was a doctor, so I've seen dead bodies before. Being married to Greg Nolan, I've witnessed so many atrocities that I'm quite numb to it all. I found Max's diary and read it as well. Poor Max. I never loved him, but I needed him. He was such a good man. So after that, we loaded up and hit the road, huh? Yes, it's only a matter of time before they find us and kill us. I had to keep moving." "Helen, I need to confirm some things. Can you tell me your story?" Let's look at Helen's story. Helen Williams met Greg Nolan at a university business lecture. Helen was charmed by the older, handsome businessman. Greg Nolan, for his part, was instantly smitten with the fiery redhead who had peppered him with questions. Greg Nolan was a successful man from a privileged background, although he did have a rebellious streak in him and liked to cut corners if it got him what he wanted. The older man successfully talked his way into a date with the 19-year-old student. Greg was smart, ambitious, charming, slightly egotistical, and romantic. Moreover, it didn't hurt that they both turned heads in any room they entered. The romance went on for 2 years and went through all the necessary stages. Greg's parents were dead, but he met Helen's mom and dad, and they too were charmed by the handsome suitor. Greg popped the question when Helen was 23 years old, as Greg at 38 felt it was time to settle down and look the part. This did not stop Greg indulging in illicit pleasures, however, and Helen would learn this the hard way. The wedding went off without a hitch, and they had a romantic 3-week vacation in Hawaii, which included a cruise of all the islands. Soon thereafter, Helen's father had been offered a position at a medical facility in England as a surgeon. This solicitation by England wasn't uncommon for an Australian doctor of well-known talent. He had readily accepted, and so for the first time in her life, Helen was left without the support of her parents. They fell in love with Europe and eventually applied for citizenship, so Helen rarely saw them. By then, Helen was working with Greg. Helen decided she wanted to put her degree in banking to good use and told Greg she was going to apply for a job with the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. "No wife of mine is going to work for another company." "What do you mean? I'll bloody well work for whoever I want." "No, you won't, you sassy bitch." That was the first time he hit her, but it wouldn't be the last. Greg of course apologized, but told her she needed to toe the line. Suffice to say, Helen remained at Nolan Investments, but on the plus side, she did enjoy the latitude she was given so she could enjoy the city life. Helen talked about children, but Greg simply laughed her off. "I've already got a couple of kids, why would I want more?" Helen was in shock, as he had never told her he had children. "Where are they?" "God knows. The mother was in Queensland last I heard. Anyway, after that I got myself snipped so no more accidents could happen." "You lied to me. You said you wanted children." "So I lied, big deal. You have a great life. All the luxuries you could want without being tied down with any snotty-nosed brats. You creep. You know I wanted children. I should leave you now." "Don't you ever leave me, Helen. You know I'd find you and kill you if you ever left. So shut up about the kids and go do some shopping." Helen knew she was in a no-win situation. She knew too much about Greg Nolan. She knew about his dodgy deals and secret bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. She knew about his perverted sexual needs. Helen was stuck, but then things got worse. When Helen was 25 years old, Greg decided it was time to leave the city and head home to Blackridge. Helen knew that there was more to it, but Greg wouldn't say. The White Castle became like a prison, whereas in the city she felt free and had her friends. Greg was getting more and more abusive and seemed to be under more pressure. Greg then hired Ronald Graves as his security chief. He came recommended by Julian and Helga Graves, their butler and maid. The only other person on the property was Max Shillington, who helped maintain White Castle. Helen was a city girl through, and Blackridge did nothing for her. Helen didn't mind the people, but the town offered little to inspire her. Helen joined the local book club, helped the church and arts council, but was still unfulfilled. Life at White Castle was getting worse. New construction began in earnest, and soon new stables were built, along with various cottages. Suddenly, and without notice, new hiring began, which included a cook, chauffeur, several young maids, and security personnel. Ronald Graves was starting to give Helen the creeps. She could always feel those sinister dark eyes on her wherever she went. She mentioned it once to Greg, but he slapped her and told her to stop talking trash about his number one guy. During that time, construction also began on a private airstrip and hangar. It took 4 months, and it was finally complete. Greg then bought himself a small Cessna 206 airplane, and suddenly the plane was taking off at night. It was all very odd and obviously illegal. Knowing Greg, Helen had lost any interest in sex with Greg. He was perverted and had forced his sick fantasies on her. He made her dress up in schoolgirl costumes. Sometimes she would be tied up and made to beg for sex. However, the final straw was when he invited other women into their bed. She refused to comply and was severely beaten for her disobedience. She soon moved out of the master bedroom and into her own room. Greg didn't seem to care, as he helped himself to the pretty young maids every night. Helen was now just a prop on Greg's arm to maintain his public persona as a happy family man. Ronald Graves was making Helen's life unbearable. If he wasn't looking at her, he was making lewd comments. She tried to avoid him at every possible opportunity. Greg could sense her unease, so instead of helping her, he had Ronald escort Helen to various events. Helen perhaps made a tactical error in moving out of the master bedroom. One night that was proven beyond doubt when Ronald Graves broke into her room and ravished her on the bed. Thankfully, the drunken steroid junkie couldn't get it up. He ended up slapping and cursing her. Helen moved back into the master bedroom the next day. She feared Ronald Graves far more than Greg, as she had heard the maids talk about what he did to them. It was graphic and very unpleasant. As soon as Helen appeared to give up, the sex parties began. The parties were held once every couple of months at White Castle. Politicians, judges, cops, and athletes were surrounded by beautiful Asian women flown in by Greg. For all appearances to the outside world, it just looked like the rich and wealthy having lavish parties, but underneath it was nothing more than a sick, twisted playboy party. Every conceivable illegal substance was made available. Drugs were being taken like candy. Sex was happening everywhere, but what really made the parties unique was the auction at the end of the night. The women were lined up, and the rich and supposedly respectable would bid on them. Massive amounts of money exchanged hands. Even a young maid called Rhonda was sold one night. Helen never knew what became of them, but she believed she would be able to help solve several homicides. She often feared she would be auctioned off, but she knew too much about the Nolan operation. However, she became aware from the maids. She was being drugged at the parties and passed around like a party favor. Helen soon found ways to avoid the parties by hiding in the empty servant quarters as the staff were released for those weekends. A close call nearly ended Greg Nolan for good. Greg had upset a high-ranking politician over the cost of a woman. The politician was going to go public and was going to the Prime Minister himself. Ronald Graves then stepped in to solve the problem, and in a move that joined him and Greg Nolan at the hip, the politician was found dead after a burglary occurred that went wrong. The sex parties were shut down, and Helen and others were restricted from going anywhere. Helen's only freedom was attending her Friday book club in Blackridge with Ronald Graves quietly watching from a distance. Helen being confined at home meant she had to find other pursuits. She took up horse riding and in turn made a very strong friendship with Max Shillington. Max knew things weren't good in the Nolans' marriage. He had also seen the developments of the property, the airfield, plus heard the rumors of the wild parties and saw the buildup of security. Now his cop instincts were coming back, and he needed to find out what was happening. Word around Blackridge was that Nolan had just opened up a bordello with high-class escorts. Helen started to open up to Max. She found Max a great companion as he made her laugh with his quick wit. Her only concern was his drinking, but it soon became clear why. Max had lost his wife and child in tragic circumstances, and the drinking eased the pain. She knew she had to have Max on her side because with his police contacts, just maybe he could get her out of this mess. With that in mind, she seduced him one day in the stables. Max was sitting on an old log just outside the stable and awaiting her return from her daily horse ride. Helen snuck up on him as he was in a world of his own in deep thought, clutching his belly. "Oh shit, Helen. You scared me." Helen giggled and said, "I didn't mean to scare you, Maxie." Maxie was her pet name for him. "It's okay. I better tend to the horse." He winced. "Max, are you okay?" "Yeah. I just cut my stomach on some barbed wire fencing." "Is it bad?" "Not too deep, but it stings a little." "Let me look at it." With that, Helen led him inside the stable. She took Max's shirt off and studied the wound. It wasn't too deep, but it was bleeding. "Wait here a minute. I'll get something to clean it up." Helen went off and returned with some saline and cream. She gently cleaned his wounds, and once that was done, she started applying the antiseptic cream. The effect was obviously very erotic for Max, and his body knew it. Max was suddenly aroused. "Oh God. Maxie, are you okay? You are getting very red in the neck and face." "Yeah, I'm okay. Thanks, Helen. I've got to go to the horse. Finish chores," he stammered. Max rose too quickly, and his arousal was now visible. Helen giggled and said, "Is this what you're worried about?" A few minutes later, Helen was busy giving Max a BJ. Helen knew it was a rotten thing to do to Max, and she felt terrible, but she was out of options. Max was her only hope of escape. For Max's part, he must have been in shock with a beautiful woman throwing herself at him. He was no idiot and started to ask some discreet questions around town. Max had made friends with a retired guy called Toby Walters. Toby fed him some information, but nothing of real consequence. Max started researching Greg Nolan and Ronald Graves. Max even contacted his old partner Ian McIntosh. They were going to meet face-to-face the following week. Helen felt terrible about what she did with Max. She really liked Max, and she felt horrible for playing on his feelings. Helen vowed to end it quickly as she didn't want to hurt him. That all changed when she overheard a business meeting involving Greg, Ronald Graves, and the police chief at the White Castle. Greg Nolan had assumed Helen and the staff were out of the house when the meeting began. The police chief Alex Flanagan had come by for his weekly payoff and the impromptu meeting with him and Ronald. Helen had come downstairs to get something to drink just as the meeting began in Greg's study. Fortunately, the door had foolishly been left slightly open, leaving Helen horrified at what she heard. "So gentlemen, another successful month," Greg said. Here," replied Alex Flanagan. "Well, Ronald, it's time to update everyone on the progress." "Alex, Greg, we have had a great month, our best so far. We now own 90% of Blackridge land. The only guy holding out is Don Peters, but he will be getting a little visit shortly, and I'm sure he'll see the light. The highway announcement will be made shortly, but he'll sell before that. I'd bet his wife and kids on that." They all laughed. "What about our other revenue sources, Ronald?" the police chief asked. "I'll let Greg tell you about that. Everything is going great. We've shipped more cocaine this month than the drug cartel. The trafficking is going well as we had 20 girls come in this month. For made the cut to the bordello, and the rest are providing the rich and desperate with vital organs. The only real problem has been your police commissioner, Alex. He wants a bigger cut for keeping the heat off. Ron and I are flying up in a couple of weeks to sort this out. Overall, another great month. Don't forget the party on the 25th at the bordello either, Alex. By the way, Greg, our town undercover mate TW reports that we have somebody snooping around and asking questions. Interesting, Alex. Ron, invite TW to the party on the 25th. I think I'll bring Liz to the party as well this time. And Ron, beef up security since it sounds like the leak is coming from here. Let's get some more cameras installed and lock down the house. Keep a good watch on the bitch as well. No worries, Greg, will do. Helen quickly returned to her room. She was horrified and scared for herself, and Max Greg Nolan didn't have to worry, however, as Helen didn't leave the house for nearly a week. She wouldn't even go and see Max. She knew she was being watched and had to protect Max. Max, in the meantime, had met with his old partner, Mac. The news from him was all bad. There was an ongoing investigation on Nolan and Graves, but every time the feds got close, evidence disappeared or political wrangling interfered. They believed Nolan and Graves were drug dealers, murderers, and also trafficked in women for prostitution. They had paid off everyone high up as judges would refuse search warrants and potential witnesses would disappear. Only inside information and irrefutable evidence would stop these scumbags, and Max was the key. Max knew what he had to do. On the 25th, Graves and Nolan left for their overnight trip. Helen knew security was lax, and since she hadn't aroused anyone's suspicion, she felt it was safe to see Max. For the past few days, she had been speaking with Liz, her maid. Liz was petrified as Greg and Ronald had been abusing her sexually, and she would be taken tonight to the party. Helen quietly vowed to herself to take Liz with her when she ran. Helen found Max at the stables where she told him all about the meeting, but unfortunately, she left out the part about someone called TW. Max in turn told Helen about his meeting with Mac and that he would need to get evidence to finish them off. It would be very tricky now with the installation of the security cameras, but he would have to get into the hangar and gather evidence. With that said, a rough plan was made since Max now knew the two monsters would be away for a couple of days on business in February. He would make his move then and have outside backup with Toby. David was useless as he still wouldn't pick up on the obvious hints Max made. With that done, Helen gave Max a long, passionate kiss. Helen quickly unbuckled Max's pants while leading him to an empty stable. Max followed and entered to find Helen already taking off her clothes. She was the complete opposite of Max's dearly departed wife. Helen was a redhead around 5 foot 8 inches tall. Max quickly tore his remaining clothes off. Max then swiftly kicked over a bale of hay and placed a horse blanket on top. He then gently laid Helen on the blanket. Helen then looked up at him. Max dropped to the floor and made love to her. Exhausted, they then fell upon one another and the hay once more. Helen then started to cry, thanking Max. She kept telling him how she had married a monster and he was her savior. Max just gently pulled her up, held and rocked her. After she got control of her emotions, she gave him a long kiss, got dressed, and went into the night. Helen felt bad, but she genuinely did like Max. She just didn't love him but wanted to keep him motivated and away from the drink. Helen got a bit of a shock heading back up to the house. Helga was outside having a smoke and saw Helen return from the stables. Hopefully it would be okay. The next morning after breakfast, Helen quickly went to see Max. She told him about Helga. They would hope for the best but would plan for the worst. Helen was to pack and hide a bag so she could move at a moment's notice. Max would be bringing someone else and he trusted in case everything went south. Helen never made the connection to TW when told his name. Max had made notes would leave a paper trail in the cottage. He told Mac to hit his cottage simultaneously when they went to clean up the scumbags. He would hide his diary, however. The major notes would go to Toby. On the 29th, Max contacted Toby to deliver the notes, but he was followed. So he aborted the mission, stopped at a drive, through to get some lunch, and returned to the cottage. Helen was starting to get cold feet. She was scared and had a bad feeling, but Max wanted no further contact for the moment. Liz had returned and spoken with Helen on what she saw. The party had been a typical Nolan and Graves affair. Drugs, booze, and beautiful women. Sex was happening everywhere and involved all types. Liz had been passed around all night and ended the night with Greg. They had a virgin auction, which reeled in a lot of money. All the big players in town attended along with the typical array of politicians, law enforcement types, criminals, and athletes. Greg had gloated to Liz that everyone was on film. He had learnt from his earlier brush with the wayward politician that insurance was needed. Helen knew that Greg and Ronald Graves would be gone on the 3rd and 4th of February. She could only wait and pray that Max got the evidence he needed before then. Greg and Ronald left early on the 3rd, and as day turned into night, Helen kept pacing the floor worrying about Max. It wasn't until she took some Valium that she finally got some sleep. Early next day, Helen awoke and headed for the stables. She found Max sitting at the table with a bottle of scotch in front of him. He was as pale as a ghost. "Maxie, are you okay?" "Helen, sorry. I went into the hangar. It's bad." "How bad?" "Look, I was a cop for 15 years and saw some bad shit, but these guys take the cake. It was tough to get in, and there were guys everywhere. The evidence is they're showing they have weapons, cocaine, and money just lying around. The plane was just taking off with a bunch of women who looked half dead. There was also a lot of blood on the floor. It's worse than we all thought. I have already spoken to Mac, and I gave Toby the heads up. I heard the men talking, and there is some sort of gathering in town on the 16th. That's the night we go for better or worse. I'll also have to grab the evidence and plant the listening devices that night. It seems awfully risky. I know, Helen, but good people are dying. I was a cop and I can't walk away from this. I'll protect you, but we can't afford to speak again. Just be ready on the 16th, my love." That was the last time Helen ever spoke to Max. Of course, on the 16th, she waited with Liz, but Max never came. Ronald Graves appeared early the next day with a big grin and informed Helen that Max had up and quit. Helen knew her time had just run out and waited for the inevitable. That was until I turned up and set back the plans of Greg Nolan and Ronald Graves. They replied in kind by keeping us apart. It was only luck that kept us alive in the end. Ironically, Ronald Graves had also delivered Helen right into my arms. What a story, Helen. Let's hope it has a happy ending, huh? I just hope Max didn't suffer. I found him, when I dragged Toby to the grave he dug for you. The prick was going to bury you right next to Max, and I guess me on top. Well, we are still alive, and now we have some decisions to make. Off the top of my head, first we have to get you to a safe location. You are a witness, but who do we trust? I would say go straight to my brother, but he is in Western Australia. It's too far even if I got in contact with him. There could be a leak somewhere down the line. I say we find Ian McIntosh. He may be the only honest copper left. But can he be trusted? I think so, Steven. I mean, Max and he were partners for 15 years. Well, he is our only option. I think we better ditch the car and get moving. What will we do for transport? Leave that to me. We waited for darkness and quietly left the hotel. I had a few tricks up my sleeve. Like any good mechanic, I could easily hotwire a car. I needed something that wouldn't stand out because we were staying in a tourist area for families. Luckily, I found a smorgasbord of options. I ended up taking a Mitsubishi Magna sedan. Helen followed me in the Ford, and we dumped it in a back alley with the door open and keys inside the ignition. Hopefully some good citizen would take it. We drove for another 90 minutes and found a cheap hotel in a large urban town. We were both tired and fell asleep in each other's arms on top of the queen-sized bed. The next morning, we both decided to do some research on Ian McIntosh. I rang my brother in Western Australia. We chatted for a while. Then I asked if he had any connections to the New South Wales police force. He actually knew a detective who was on the up and up, and he would make some discreet inquiries about Ian McIntosh. I was to call him back in a couple of hours. With a few hours to kill, I shaved my beard off, had a shower, redressed my wounds, and then grabbed some breakfast. Helen had gone shopping for a disposable mobile phone, some fresh clothes for both of us, and she was getting her hair cut. We would meet back at the hotel at lunchtime. I decided to dump the car. I found a large shopping complex and left the car in one of the parking bays. I then casually walked back to the hotel to make my call. My side was starting to hurt, and I needed to rest as well. I got back to the hotel room and had to sit down as my side was starting to bleed again. I cleaned up just in time for Helen to return. Helen brought in bags of clothes, but what had me in awe was that she had cut her hair short, and it actually highlighted her facial features. She was a very beautiful woman, and I could actually feel myself becoming aroused. "You look beautiful, Helen." I blurted out. "Why, thank you, kind sir. You're not too bad yourself." I must have looked like a fool as I was still staring at her. Earth to Steven. "What, sorry? Are you going to take it?" "Take what?" "The phone." "Oh yeah, I'll call Bobby." I took the mobile phone and called my brother, who picked up after a couple of rings. "Bobby Cahill." "Bobby, it's Steven." "Hey Steven, I got that information, but before I give it to you, are you in some sort of trouble, big brother?" "No trouble, I just know a mate of his ex-partner actually." "Well, I wasn't able to talk to my mate as he is on holidays. I did a check through some other sources. Ian McIntosh is a cop's cop, if you get my drift. He has run several major task forces, his arrest record and conviction rate is top-notch, and he has assisted internal affairs to help stamp out corruption. The guy is a straight shooter and clean as a whistle. A lot of people think he will be police commissioner one day. Fantastic, he's exactly the guy I thought he was. You got the phone number for him? My brother provided me with Ian McIntosh's direct phone number, so I bid my brother farewell and promised to catch up. Well, Helen, he's clean. I better make the call. Okay, I'm going to grab the newspaper from reception and I'll be back. I phoned Ian McIntosh, but only got his answering service. I left my name and number and asked him to call me back in regards to Max Shillington. Hopefully we wouldn't have to wait long. 10 minutes later, Helen returned. She looked terrible, as white as a ghost and trembling. Helen, are you okay? The paper. Here, read. I grabbed the Sydney newspaper and the front page had a headline saying, "Decorated detective killed in hit and run." It went on to state that in tragic circumstances, Detective Ian McIntosh was killed in a hit and run crossing a street near the courthouse that morning. The driver had escaped and McIntosh died on the way to hospital. I turned and looked at Helen, who was sitting on the bed still shaking. Christ, Helen, what are we going to do now? I was holding Helen on the bed and I was completely out of ideas. We looked at each other and the fear in her eyes reflected my own. It felt like the Grim Reaper had entered the room and was silently watching us. I don't know what really happened, maybe the adrenaline, maybe the fear of death, or even the underlying attraction, but the next thing I remember is kissing Helen with a hunger I had never experienced. I'm not even sure who made the first move. When our kiss finally ended, we found the hunger still remained. If anything, our desire had gone up a level. We quickly began to remove each other's clothing as our passion hit crisis point. I think I had been waiting for this moment from the first time I saw her standing on the side of the road. When the final articles of clothing were removed, we gazed into each other's eyes and the sparks flew. She was a truly beautiful woman, one that should be fought for and in another era perhaps even worshipped. I could feel she needed to let loose as much as I did. We needed to release the days of stress and panic through this act of stimulation. My side burned, but I ignored the obvious pain. We had wild sex, and when finished we both laid there panting. I gently opened my arms and Helen nestled into me. We lay there for an hour holding and rocking each other. Then it came to me. Helen, have a shower and get dressed. I know what to do. Big Red, Helen. Maybe, just maybe, he'll help us. We had both just finished showering and had changed into our new clothes. Who's Big Red? A friend, I think. Months before I had entered Blackridge and the disaster I was now in, I had found myself in a small town on the New South Wales/Victorian border. It was a rough town called Murraywater. Murraywater was known for its drug trade and large multicultural inhabitants. Trouble was always brewing, as there was a mix of criminals, bigots, and fools. I had found myself in a dingy little pub called the Rose and Crown and was having a quiet beer before moving on down the road. The clientele of drunks, criminals, and general riffraff was about what I had expected. The commotion started over at the pool table, and soon an old-fashioned Donnybrook had started. I don't know what made me get involved in the stoush. Perhaps it was because of the unfair odds of 3 against 1, or more likely, because one guy had brought a gun to a fist fight. The man surrounded was a big red-headed biker. He was about 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed in the neighborhood of around 230 pounds. Now, normally I'd reckon the big fellow would be able to handle those odds, but the gun had now tilted the odds. I casually got up and grabbed a pool cue. The fight was obviously over the pool game, as money had been on it, and the biker had been accused of cheating. The guy with the gun leveled the pistol at the biker's chest and was demanding the money. I could smell a setup, but why they picked the biker was beyond me. As they were distracted watching the biker, I came from behind and smashed the guy's pistol hand with the cue. He went down in agony. Then it was a free-for-all. The fighting began in earnest, and by the end of it, there were 3 unconscious fools with severe facial injuries. Thanks for the help, stranger. Name's Big Red. Hi, I'm Stephen Cahill. Well, Stephen, you ever need anything, just holler. We spent the rest of the time drinking together at another pub down the road, even though the police didn't usually care to get involved in these types of disputes. I found out that Big Red was the sergeant of arms for a biker group called the Crazy Riflemen. He was in Murraywater doing a gun deal. At the end of the night, he wrote down his number and told me to call him if I ever needed anything. I just hope I had kept that card. Hello, Big Red, this is Stephen. Stephen Cahill, my white knight. How are you, my man? Big Red. You remember me? Of course. You play a mean game of pool. He laughed. Does the offer still stand? Of course, my man. What can I do for you? I need to meet with you somewhere safe. How about our clubhouse? Meet me at the Royal Hotel at 10 a.m. and I'll take you there. I'm bringing a lady friend with me, is that cool? Of course. I'll let the boys know, and don't worry, you'll have safe passage. They'll keep their hands to themselves. Big Red gave me the directions, and we would meet tomorrow morning. It was a 5-hour drive, so I would need to locate some wheels and get moving. Helen didn't seem thrilled with my plan, but we were out of options, and I had an idea that would make these bikers friends for life. There was something I knew that would sweeten the pot. I found a Toyota Corolla hatchback in the hotel lot that would do for the journey to Sterling, the location of the Crazy Rifleman's clubhouse. We were 3 hours into the journey with Helen driving when I got a call on the mobile. Jesus Christ, Stephen, what have you done? Bobby. What's wrong, brother? Stephen, just tell me. Were you in Sydney this morning? No, why? I just got pulled into my boss office. He asked why I had run a check on Detective Ian McIntosh of the NSW police force. I didn't have an answer, and I've been suspended, but not before he asked if I knew the location of you and someone called Helen Nolan. New South Wales detectives are flying to Western Australia to interview me and will be here tomorrow. Jesus, the man has a long reach. Who we're talking about, Stephen? Look, the less you know, the better. Just tell them everything. I don't want you involved any more than you have already been. I'll sort this out myself. Well, that's your call, brother. I can't help you if you don't tell me anything. Just to let you know, there is an APB out on you and this woman. You've been accused of the hit and run of Ian McIntosh. They have a witness to the accident who swears it was you and a woman driving. You're in deep shit. Do you know the name of the witness? No, they've kept that close to their chest. Please be careful, brother. If you need me, call me, but lose the phone you have. I will. Thanks, Bobby, and I'm sorry. I got Helen to pull the car over, and I smashed the phone into little bits. It's getting worse, Helen. If Big Red doesn't come through, we're finished. I know, Stephen, but keep the faith. That would be easier said than done. I had a feeling I had bitten off way more than I could chew. We made it to Sterling in just less than 5 hours. We found a cheap hotel and went through the same routine of dumping the stolen car. We then had dinner and retired for the night. We were both rattled by the turn of events. It was not a good feeling being Australia's most wanted, and I was sure that we would be shot on sight. Cops hated nothing more than cop killers. I was slowly pacing the room back and forth and finally looked up. Helen signaled me to come over to the bed. I had a pretty good idea on what was about to happen, so I just went with it as I figured we could be dead tomorrow. When I got to the bed, I leaned in and kissed Helen ever so slowly. Soon we made love. Once we were done, we both caught our breath and gently kissed. Eventually, we fell asleep in each other's arms, completely spent. At 10 a.m., we were standing out front of Royal Hotel in Sterling. I heard the distinctive roar of Harley Davidsons. Big Red pulled up with 2 other members of the Crazy Rifleman. He got off his bike and pulled me into a bear hug. White Knight, good to see you. Thanks, Big Red. You're killing me. I groaned. Sorry about that, buddy. Let me introduce you to my son, Little Red, and another club member, Pete, but we call him Animal. Don't ask. Everybody shook hands and I introduced them to Helen. With the introductions made, we climbed on the back of the cycles and roared off to the clubhouse, which was located just outside the town limit in Sterling. The clubhouse was nothing like I expected. It was more like a military complex, completely fenced in with large dorm-style housing. There was a firing range, workshop, and a large house situated in the middle of the complex. I was very impressed. It actually reminded me a bit of my life on an army base. Unfortunately, Helen wasn't as comfortable. I didn't know much about outlaw motorcycle gangs apart from the obvious known criminal connections. Big Red explained that the Crazy Rifleman was formed originally back in the late 1960s by some veterans of the Vietnam War. We would be meeting with the national president of the Crazy Rifleman Motorcycle Club, a Mr. Joseph I. Runhorse Harrison. Big Red explained he was the sergeant-at-arms for the Crazy Rifleman. Big Red's principal duty was to maintain order at club meetings, functions, and runs. He seemed to be completely loyal to the president. I guess due to his size, he must have been the strongest member of the group and most likely quelled disorder and administered any punishments to fellow members when directed. He seemed very proud of his son Little Red, who was the national enforcer. Apparently his son answered directly to the national president. He also saw to it that the president's orders were carried out and acted as the president's bodyguard. He also handled special situations and assignments. It was enough information for me, and I decided to ask no more until the meeting. Looking around, it was obvious to me that the gang was involved in drugs and weapons, which would play right into my hands. At a guess, I figured they were also into prostitution, and it looked like they had a chop shop operation as well. I just hoped the meeting would go well. I couldn't believe that I was turning to criminals for help because they were more trustworthy than the NSW police force. I had one shot at this and I had to make it count. It all came down to this meeting and my sales skills. Helen was asked to wait outside, as this would be men's business. Joseph I. Runhorse Harrison was nothing like I imagined. He was a short, fat, bald man who had obviously seen better days, going by the scars on his face. However, the man had charisma and knew how to survive. Welcome, Mr. Cahill. I should thank you firstly for helping out Big Red. I don't know what I'd do without the big lug. No thanks required. I was just at the right place at the right time. I was actually surprised, as I didn't expect this man to be so articulate. I knew this was not a man to be messed with nor underestimated. I decided to forego all my preconceived ideas and just talk to the guy. I want to thank you for taking this meeting, Mr. Harrison. Hey, just call me Joe. Thanks, Joe. Well, let's cut to the chase. What can we do for you? I hope you've got a bit of time, as I have a story and a proposition for you. Go ahead, Stephen. You've intrigued me. I took my time and explained the whole story of Nolan and Graves, including being on the run from the law and the need for their help. Well, that's quite a story, Stephen. But why should we help? Joe, I left out the best bit. If you help me shut this operation down, you guys will walk away with more drugs, cash, and probably weapons than you can carry. Maybe. But if this guy is as connected as you say, why would I want to bring that sort of heat down on my gang? I can't answer that question. I'm only asking for your help to cause a distraction while I take care of business. It's an interesting offer, but I'll have to call a war council together to discuss the pros and cons. It will take a few days to get everyone here. In the meantime, you and your woman can stay here under our protection. Thank you. I can't ask more than that. The meeting ended with a handshake and I left the room. I found Helen waiting anxiously outside. How did it go? They will consider it. We'll know in a few days. What will we do if they say no? I don't know, Helen. Big Red showed us to our room, and again I was duly impressed. It had all the comforts of home, including an ensuite bathroom. We both decided to have a rest before finding some dinner. I awoke some time later to find Helen kissing me. The woman was insatiable, and I wondered how much of this was an act considering what she had done to Max. You know you don't have to do this, Helen. I want to, Stephen. I need you. My logic was soon dismissed as my pleasure began to rise. She slowly placed warm kisses down my chest. Soon, we made love. I was beginning to wonder if this woman was going to be the reason for my death, one way or the other. Helen decided to stay in the room and relax as she didn't feel like being ogled by the bikers. I promised I would find some food and return later. I was going to explore a little and talk with Big Red. I found him at one of the many on-site workshops they had as he was working on his bike. The bike was a custom-built 2006 Screamin' Eagle Fat Boy imported from America. It looked like a nice ride and would have cost a pretty penny. Nice ride, Red. Hey, Stephen. Yes, she's my pride and joy. Look, I can't thank you enough for giving me the opportunity to present my case to the president. My pleasure. Look, I shouldn't be saying this, but if the council goes against you tomorrow, me and my boy will still help you. Won't that get you in trouble? Nah, Joe will give us his blessing, although it will be under the table. Anyway, enough chat, let's grab a beer. Big Red took me to a bar that was set up in the main house on the property. I was introduced to many of the club members. All I could say was that I was glad I was a friend and not a foe. Most of them looked like they had spent time at the big house. After a few drinks with the boys, I rounded up some food and went back to the room with 2 large plates. Helen readily accepted the food and we ate and talked. I told her the good news that regardless of the meeting tomorrow, we had the support of Big Red. That seemed to calm her, and she drifted off to sleep. I was exhausted myself, and I was asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. We both slept in the next morning, but I was awoken around 9 a.m. by the roar of engines. I looked out the window, and there was a procession of bikes entering the property. The council had arrived. I would make myself scarce until a decision was reached. By then Helen had awakened as well. To keep ourselves occupied, we made love twice. As I was lying back in the bed with Helen, there was a knock on the door. I threw on a t-shirt and shorts and Helen did the same. It was Big Red at the door, and he looked concerned. Gee, that meeting was quick, Red. Nah, it's still going, mate. You need to switch on the TV. The shit has hit the fan. There was a TV in the room, so I switched to the Channel 9 morning news. You never expect to see your face on screen behind the head of the news anchor with the word "wanted" in a banner below. It seemed I was wanted for questioning in connection to the murder of Detective Ian McIntosh and the kidnapping of Mrs. Helen Nolan. This news went nationwide, so no place was safe now. Bugger. That ain't good, Red. No, it's not. But this is a complete stitch-up, cause I know you weren't in Sydney when it happened. They'll figure that out eventually. Doesn't matter. This is being done just to draw me out, or so I make a mistake. They want me dead. They know the charges won't stick, but then again, I'll never see the inside of a jail cell unless I get caught by some country bumpkin cop. Well, you're probably right. Knowing the criminal element like I do, they'll expect you to run, not head back into the fire. Well, let's hope I can pull this off, as I have no choice now. Well, I'll let you be. I'll be back when the council has a decision. Thanks, Red. Before you go, can I borrow a mobile phone? I turned to Helen after he left. I think I better call my brother. I've got a bad feeling. I decided to risk it and call my brother. I needed to know he was okay. I dialed the number, but it went straight to voicemail. I told him to call Buddha and left the number. He'd get that for sure. When we were kids, I had a brief period where I was quite chubby, and with my shaved head, Bobby used to tease me by calling me Buddha. The nickname stuck, but was rarely used now. The good thing about hanging with criminals is that you always had access to the latest technology. Big Red assured me the phone couldn't be traced. The call came about an hour later. I had just finished lunch. Buddha, it's Bobby. Hey Bobby, thanks for calling back. Good work, by the way. I got the Buddha thing straight away. Are you okay? Yes, still suspended, but I'm more concerned with you. You're a very popular boy right now. Public enemy number one, so to speak. The detectives I spoke to don't buy it though. They were under orders from the NSW police commissioner himself to only follow one line of investigation. You. They know like I do that it stinks to high heaven, but someone very powerful is pulling the strings. I don't know who you pissed off, bro, but they have it in for you. You are charged with kidnapping as well, but you have a bigger problem. Cops hate cop killers, so stay out of sight. I'm going to be working my contacts to sort out this mess. Bobby, back off and don't do anything. What the hell do you mean don't do anything? I'm your brother, for God's sake. Exactly, Bobby, you're my brother, I love you. You make a move on these people, they will kill you. I have things in hand. Jesus, Steven, what have you got yourself involved in? I was summoned to see Joe, and Big Red would be coming with me. As before, Helen was left out of the discussions. We found Joe back behind his desk in the main house. If it wasn't for the scars and obvious biker attire, I could have sworn Joseph Harrison was the head of a Fortune 500 company. Then again, he probably was, albeit an illegal version. Steven, I hope you have found the accommodation suitable? Yes, thanks Joe, I feel very welcome. We've really broke with tradition allowing an outsider in our inner sanctum, but Big Red insisted and I owed him, so I allowed it. But we can't be seen as allowing a stranger here. Not good for business. So, on the back of you saving our sergeant-at-arms, we have decided to make you an honorary member of the Crazy Rifleman Motorcycle Club. Joe went on to explain, as an honorary member, I would be allowed to party with them and go on runs. He insisted I had earned this honor for saving the life of a member. With that out of the way, we got on with the business at hand. Well, Steven, we are in. In fact, our Vice President Rudy Moose Lorenzo personally wants to be involved. As soon as I mentioned the name Ronald Graves, he was chomping at the bit. That's fantastic, Joe. Can I ask why the excitement from your vice president? Let's just say he owes Mr. Graves. Moose spent 5 years in jail on some bogus drug charges when he was in his late teens because of that copper. I couldn't believe it. I had the support of the Crazy Rifleman with one very motivated vice president. Thing we're finally looking up. I know this is your show, Steven, but I've sent a couple of men to Blackridge to check on Mr. Nolan and Mr. Graves. We just wanted to make sure it is business as usual. They will be discreet, and they have actually gone up in business suits, driving a Holden Commodore. They were not impressed, but they need to fit in. I should have a report back tonight. That's great, Joe. I want to keep the plan simple. I just need a big distraction, perhaps half the men we use to tear up Blackridge to keep the cops busy, and the other half to tear up the Nolan property. I can then get inside and take care of Nolan, and I'll leave Graves to Moose if you'd like. Good, the simpler the better. We'll wait for the report from my men, and then move tomorrow to our clubhouse at East Parkford, which is roughly 30 minutes from Blackridge. Moose is already at East Parkford making preparations. I then set about drawing maps of the property so the men could familiarize themselves. Joe seemed pleased, and I said, well, I guess it's just a waiting game now. I went back to the room to find Helen watching TV. I gave her the good news, including that we would be moving to East Parkford tomorrow. For the first time in ages, she actually smiled. I think we need to celebrate, Steven, she said with a cocked eyebrow. Yep, this woman was definitely going to kill me. However, I got my clothes off in record time and sat down on the bed. Helen started doing a very sexy striptease that had me rising to the occasion. Soon we had sex again. In the aftermath, I held her. She was trembling, and her fingers dug into my arms. She was hiding something, but I didn't know what. I was called into the meeting room once again to speak with Joe. The report was back and the news was good. All the players in this drama were at White Castle. It was business as usual, and they wouldn't see me coming. After I left, I went to find Big Red. He was working on his bike again. Hey, Red. Hi, Steven. Just getting the bike ready for the road trip. I need a favor. Name it. I need some time at the range with a weapon. Come with me. Big Red took me to the supply house. He told me to pick anything I wanted and that I could keep it. They had enough weapons to start a war and supply an army. I selected a Beretta 92 FS M9 and was then shown to the range. The Beretta M9A1 or 92 FS is a good long-range 9mm pistol and the most tested pistol since the .45 cal M1911A1, used by the U.S. military and thousands of police officers worldwide. It is a solid design pistol with a 15-shot clip, and nothing shoots better than a well-used Beretta 92 FS. That day I fired around 200 rounds. I was rusty, but by the end of the day, I was a passable shot. After finishing at the range, I returned to the room and Helen. She was watching TV and had tears running down her face. Helen, what's wrong? The TV. That creep. She wasn't making sense. I looked at the news channel, and on the screen was Greg Nolan. He was offering a $100,000 reward for information leading to my capture. He was crying and begging for the return of his beloved wife Helen. It was quite a performance and I was stunned. Why was he drawing attention to himself? He always did things under the radar so not to draw attention. I needed to know why, and I thought Helen had all the answers. Helen, what's going on? I don't know. Helen, please. He's going public. That's a huge risk for a drug dealer and human trafficker. Please tell me, Helen. She stunned me with her reply. I'm pregnant. I had to take hold of myself. One thing I knew is it wasn't mine. Things were starting to make sense. Go on, Helen. Whose is it? It's Max's, but Greg thinks it's his baby. He found my pregnancy test and now thinks he has an heir to his kingdom. She started to cry once more and I held her tight, kissing her forehead. I knew it was now essential to stop this monster. The trip to East Parkford was uneventful. Although we drew attention, no one thought to look for me in a 100-strong bike gang. The clubhouse at East Parkford was a somewhat smaller than Sterling, but just as secure. I met with Moose and the road captains. 50 men would head for Blackridge and keep the cops busy. We had 60 men to cause trouble at White Castle. Big Red and 5 others would come with me, and we would hit the hangar. The rest would tear around the property, causing havoc. Moose wanted Ronald Graves alive and would deal with him himself. Helen would be staying at the clubhouse, protected personally by Little Red. I kissed Helen goodbye and I knew this was make or break time. I had to succeed, and although we had many men at our disposal, we had found out that Nolan had his whole security force at White Castle, which numbered 50 men or so. They were all well-trained and well-armed. We hit the outskirts of Blackridge around 7 p.m., right on dusk. The town no doubt could hear the roar of the engines. 110 men, all on bikes. The crazy rifleman rode into town, and I felt like I was in the middle of a western. Doors were being shut, cars were pulling to the side of the road, and people were running to return home. The gang then split up as 50 men went to cause havoc around Blackridge. The rest of us headed for White Castle. We were armed and very dangerous, but then again so were they. The roar of the engines was deafening, and I had no doubt, as we sped up the road, that Nolan knew we were coming. They were ready, so someone had tipped White Castle off. Men were running all over the property with weapons in hand. We had expected this and knew the odds going in. Our group split off in all directions. Big Red and I headed for the hangar. There were more men than we anticipated near the hangar, so we dumped the bike, ran for cover, and found some large rocks. The other 5 guys that were supposed to be with us were tied down under fire elsewhere. I had been in the Army for 20 years, but as a mechanic, and had seen virtually no combat except for the war games. It was a completely different and frightening experience, but I had to hold my nerve, and I was happy that Big Red was by my side. There was gunfire and the occasional burst of explosions. Grenades, I figured. I felt like I was in the middle of a war zone in Bosnia, and my fear was rising, especially as we were pinned behind some large rocks with bullets flying past. Big Red was returning fire. I came out of my daze and opened fire myself. My first few shots were hopeless, but I tried to control my breathing and found that my bullets were getting closer to the intended targets. A running figure made a dash towards a large rock about 10 meters away from us. I aimed and was about to fire when there was a large boom next to me. Big Red used his shotgun, and the running figure fell to the ground in a heap. I could hear gun battles all over the estate, and I just hoped the other guys had tied down the local police force, otherwise we were done for. I decided to make a run for the next rock. Big Red nodded and would provide cover. I made my dash, but nearing the rock, I fell hard, tripped by my own feet along the uneven ground. I felt dazed, but I heard Big Red shouting and firing his weapon. I crawled to the safety of the rock. I carefully peeked around the rock and could make out a figure bobbing up now and then firing towards Big Red. I checked my weapon and aimed. His head bobbed up and I fired. It was a good shot and hit him square in the face. I was breathing hard and shaking from the adrenaline. All was quiet from behind that rock, so I crawled towards it. I found the dead man lying prone on the ground. No one else was around. I figured they had retreated to the hangar or gone to help their friends. I signaled to Big Red and he joined me. We cautiously raced towards the hangar and found no further resistance. We entered the structure and found it all quiet. We decided to separate briefly and check to ensure no one was hiding in wait. I made it to the Cessna 206 and decided to put my real Army skills to work. I carefully tinkered with the plane's fuel line. It would get off the ground but plummet to the earth very quickly if it got in the air. I had just completed the task when I heard a pistol discharge. I quickly made my way to the direction of the noise and found Big Red laying against a wall, his right arm dangling. "Red, are you okay?" "Yeah, got bushwhacked." Maggot was hiding behind the desk. "He shot me in the arm and I went down. Cracked my knee and I can't move." "Sorry, Steven." "It's all right, Red, I'll find him and then get you out of here." "Okay, watch yourself." It was that same prick on TV last night, Greg Nolan. Well, I had hoped it would come down to this. I needed to see Nolan dead for myself. I thought I heard a noise back in the main hangar space, so I slowly made my way back. I checked my pistol and figured I was ready to deal with Mr. Greg Nolan. I entered the room and looked around. I couldn't see anyone. I walked up towards the plane. Running feet. I turned. A body ran straight into me. I hit the plane with my pistol hand extended. A karate-style chop removed the gun from my hand. It was Nolan. He threw a punch. I ducked. An uppercut lifted me off my feet. I was dazed. A well-timed kick to my ribs. I rolled and gingerly got to my feet. He charged once more, screaming. I met him head-on, tackling him, and his body went straight into a table with a thundering crash. His head hit the concrete, and he was out cold. I quickly retrieved my pistol and went to check on Big Red. Big Red was still conscious, and I helped him to his feet. We slowly made our way when I heard the noise of a plane starting and making its way to takeoff. "Shit, drop me, Steven, and get him." I gently eased Big Red to the ground and dashed back to the room. Nolan had played possum and was the one in the cockpit. He gave me a smile and a middle finger as he was on the runway. I fired some half-hearted shots towards the plane, but I knew he was in for one hell of a surprise when he got in the air. I went and got Big Red. The big fella was cursing. God damn it, he got away. Nah, Red, I was a Boy Scout. Always be prepared. I found a comfortable seat for Red as we watched the plane in the air. The spluttering started, and I could hear the engines conk out. As I had expected, the plane tail spinned into the ground with a Mr. Greg Nolan at the helm. "Goodbye, a-hole," I muttered to myself. The gunfight ended with many of Greg's security personnel either injured or dead. Some of them escaped. Money can't always buy loyalty. The crazy rifleman had injuries and 2 deaths. Moose had captured Ronald Grave. On a side note, apparently Julian and Helga were killed in a gun battle after they started firing at Moose and some other members. David, Liz, and Rebecca were nowhere to be found. The crazy rifleman made quick work of the cleanup and found all the cash, drugs, and weapons I promised. I, on the other hand, found an interesting collection of videotapes. A couple of SUVs were confiscated and filled with the goodies, and we all headed back to East Parkland. Sometimes later. Will that be all, Han? Yes, thanks, ma'am. Good coffee, by the way. I find myself in a nice town called Hillbrook in the state of Queensland. I like the town and the weather is nice and warm. I enjoy my casual lifestyle, and things are much better in the sunshine state of Queensland. I still haven't heard from Helen, and I doubt I will. I was a means to an end. By the time we got back to East Parkland, Helen was gone. She had hedged her bets and given Little Red the slip. I guess she always had a backup plan. The White Castle operation netted the crazy rifleman a very handy profit in the millions. No police investigation was ever conducted into the White Castle affair. I guess they were far too busy with the scandals and all. You see, the videotape collection found its way to all the news channels. It was a massive sex, human trafficking, and money scandal. It took down police commissioners, cops, politicians, priests, athletes, actors, and many other prominent members of the community. The mess is still being sorted out, and many people face long jail times. Greg Nolan was remembered in a service as the savior of Blackridge, taken away by the untimely plane crash that took his life. Funny, no other dead bodies were ever found on the property, so one assumes the police chief of Blackridge was not only good but fast. Big Red survived, is recovering nicely, and wants to catch up with me next month. As for Ronald Graves, I don't know and I don't ask. I just know that he no longer walks this earth. In the meantime, I'm going to find some work in this pretty little town. For a time, the life of a drifter suits me. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.